Coming up on today's episode.
You can't say, oh, there's no money at home, I'm going to eat pap and wors every day.
Yes, exactly. And on the point of pap, incidentally, it doesn't have to be bad.
So you cook it and then you allow it to cool down.
And then you reheat it. That goes for like most starches, just to make it a little bit healthier. Do that with your pap. And that'll have a better effect on your blood sugar than when it was initially cooked.
Hello and welcome to Colourful Layers, a space for colourful conversations to inspire a better you and me. My name is Motso Taje and I am a storyteller as well as a former radio broadcaster. Thank you so much for joining me in this space. I will be chatting to some of the world's bright minds, strong voices, as well as experts. Today I chat to registered dietitian and nutritional consultant by the name of Lila Bruk. She shares a quick breakdown on the different barriers to achieving healthy weight loss. We do have the full episode, so if you would like to listen to the entire conversation, make sure you go back to our channel and you can check it out. Let's get right into it.
So you get to this point in your life, I am ready, I want to lose weight. And I mean, from my personal experience, you start searching for information, but then you get to a point where you kind of like hit a snag, where you kind of trying everything, but nothing seems to work, or nothing seems to work like how it used to. And we would say, it's the age, your metabolism, until I eventually went to see a doctor and I learned around insulin resistance, which we'll touch on in a little bit. So you mentioned to me that there's actually quite a vast number of reasons or categories or barriers that could actually be affecting you from achieving this goal. So can you just name the ones that you're going to take us through?
Sure. So obviously hormonal reasons is a big one. Also emotional eating or binge eating, medical reasons like hormonal problems, which insulin resistance also comes into, also financial reasons, lack of knowledge or lack of education. Have I left any out? Hopefully not. But there are many reasons, and it's very rarely is it solely about being lazy or just not trying hard enough. And also on that point, very rarely is it about sort of just, my dog just walked in because he heard his name earlier, obviously. Very rarely is it about just your age. So often people will say, when I reach the age of fill in the blank, my metabolism slowed down. It's not like your body knows, you're 35, sorry, it's all downhill from now. Or, you're 22. You're 55. It doesn't work that way. So it's more a case of there's other elements, other things that have changed. So people might say, ever since I turned, let's say, 25, I've gained weight. But it's most likely the case of that maybe from then, maybe you were at varsity, you were more active then, and now you are working a desk job and you're barely moving and you're not playing like, I don't know, whatever sport you were playing when you're at varsity, and now you're much less active from that point of view. Maybe your eating habits have changed. So there's usually other factors involved. It's very rarely just a number, an age number. It generally doesn't work like that.
True. Firstly, I want to say I'm so glad you touched on that whole age thing and the metabolism, because I think you've just literally set a lot of people free.
Good. I'm glad.
And I think for me personally, I've had to go back and actually assess, like, especially after COVID or during COVID, I wasn't moving enough. Some habits that are not so good might have crept in, where it's easier to just go to Uber Eats than to actually cook up a meal, and so on and so forth. All right, so we're going to get into these barriers and just unpack them a little bit. And I think because I have vested interest in this one, what is insulin resistance? And I guess, why does it matter?
So insulin resistance is it's not necessarily about having high insulin levels, but maybe let's backtrack in terms of what insulin does. So insulin is a hormone that's involved with bringing glucose into your cells. So glucose or sugar, whatever you want to think of it as, but essentially think of it like a key. And it's the key that opens a door, the door being sort of entrance to a cell, if you can think about it that way. If this is too obscure, then tell me. But so basically the insulin acts as a key to open the cell to allow glucose to come in. So essentially what happens then is you eat whatever food you eat, it gets broken down through digestion into glucose, sugar. It then gets used by the cells. So it's taken up by the cells, and that's how it then performs all the various jobs it needs to do. So if you have a situation where your body that system isn't functioning as it should, obviously it's going to affect various aspects in your body, and your body won't be able to work as it should. So in terms of then the insulin, because it allows the glucose to come into the cell, it has a very important role in terms of blood sugar management and obviously various functions within the body. In the case of insulin resistance, it becomes a situation where it's almost like the insulin is less effective. So I always compare it to someone who might have some sort of hearing difficulty. So it's not a case of that someone who is hearing impaired in whatever way doesn't have ears necessarily. They have ears, but the ears aren't as sensitive to the sound around them. So therefore, they cope better when the sound is louder. So in the same way, if you have a situation where you have insulin resistance, it generally, or it can often mean that you do have enough insulin. It's enough insulin circulating in the body, but the body can't sense that insulin as well as it should. So it's a case of that. It's almost like the body has a higher need then for insulin in order to be able to sense it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
No, definitely.
So then what happens is that because of that, very often your insulin levels can become higher because your body's kind of constantly producing more and more insulin in order to get the same effects. And that's why very often people might test and have high insulin levels. But the insulin levels on its own is not necessarily a guaranteed indication of insulin resistance. There's usually got to be other elements involved as well, which we can also discuss. So, that's basically how the insulin resistance works. And a lot of people may have insulin resistance and actually not even know. It can be sort of undiagnosed for many years.
Sure. And is it something that, lifestyle gets you to that point, or is it hereditary? How do you find yourself in the situation?
So there certainly can be hereditary aspects to it, but certainly diet and lifestyle, that would be sort of the biggest factor, most likely. So if someone is, if they have quite a poor diet, if they have a lot of refined carbohydrates, so like all the sort of white starches, white breads, white rice, high sugar diet, very little activity, sort of generally sort of a lifestyle that's not ideal from a health point of view, then there is a greater chance or a greater risk of insulin resistance. There also is sort of a link in terms of, this is where the waist measurement thing comes in that I was mentioning earlier. So if your waist circumference measurement for women is above 88 and for men is above about 103, 104, then there's a greater chance that there's insulin resistance present as well. So It's not necessarily only something you can tell, okay, well, I have my insulin checked and it's fine, because your insulin levels might not necessarily always be extremely high. There can be other indications that may actually be an issue or may be relevant in that respect as well.
Sure. Scary that you could actually be, functioning every day and you have this thing, but you don't even know about it.
Yes,
and I read an article where they also called it a monster hormone because it presents weight gain, inflammation, and chronic disease. Is this correct?
Yes.
And if so, can you share more on those?
Certainly. So the problem is that insulin is a fat storage hormone. So if your insulin levels are high, you've got a greater risk of storing more fat, essentially. So there's a risk basically with insulin resistance. There's a higher chance then of weight gain or being overweight. But in the same way, if you have insulin resistance, it often is harder to lose weight. So it's a bit of this vicious circle. Because of the high insulin being a fat storage hormone, it's more conducive to weight gain and less conducive to weight loss. Therefore, harder to lose weight and easier to gain weight. And the fact that the person's overweight means it's easier to stay in that insulin-resistant state. Certainly, that is the case. In terms of also, you mentioned, what was the second one you mentioned? So you mentioned the overweight.
Inflammation and chronic disease.
Yes. So what tends to happen is that because insulin resistance is associated with fat gain rather, what does tend to happen as well is that fat itself is a very pro-inflammatory organ. People don't think of fat as an organ, but it actually is. Because of that, fat also, it produces, maybe organ, or should we say it's a tissue? Whatever, either way. So fat is very pro-inflammatory. And it also produces its own hormones, incidentally, which is interesting. And it produces chemicals that can actually increase inflammation. So fat itself causes more inflammation. And So that is an issue in terms of causing more of a pro-inflammatory state. And in addition to that, often insulin resistance is associated with other chronic diseases, such as hypertension or high blood pressure, such as high cholesterol or other sort of issues in terms of cholesterol levels, such as high triglycerides. So it functions often in a situation where it's not just about, the person can't lose weight, but in terms of the multifactorial issue as well. And also often insulin resistance is a precursor to diabetes. So it sort of all kind of connects together in terms of the effect it has. And obviously then diabetes has its own potential repercussions.
And so if I'm sitting there listening to this, can I assess like quick signs that I can look for to know if whether or not I could potentially be insulin resistant, and what do I need to do?
So insulin resistance, I mean, if you sort of are without any blood tests, in terms of just physical signs. So a big one is you can measure your waist circumference. So as I said, for women, if it's above 88, for men, if it's above 103, 104, there's differing opinions. That's why there's two numbers I just gave. So if your waist measurement falls into one of those numbers, then that would be the case that you do have a higher risk for insulin resistance. Also weight gain. Very often there's a family history of diabetes. And also very often there's something called acanthosis nigricans, where you have darkening of the skin, especially sort of on the neck or maybe even the face. I'm not talking about pigmentation, like say when a woman is pregnant and she's kind of has pigmentation from that or pigmentation from the sun, but it's more a darkening of the skin that would happen sort of around the folds of the skin. So like say the neck is a common area. And also people with insulin resistance are quite prone to skin tags. Doesn't mean everyone skin tags is insulin resistance, but often there's a link. Also people with insulin resistance generally have more of like an apple-shaped body where they have more fat stored around the stomach, hence the waist circumference, rather than sort of a pear shape where the weight is more distributed around sort of the hips, thighs. So it's a case of that. Those are some signs. It doesn't mean that if you have any of those, you automatically have insulin resistance, but it is a good idea just to obviously check these things out and see where you stand with it.
All right. Okay. That's so interesting. And then you also mentioned there was something else you wanted to mention in addition to this topic?
Yes. So in terms of PCOS, so PCOS stands for polycystic ovarian syndrome, and it's basically a hormonal disorder that affects women sort of in what they call reproductive age. So generally during the time they'll be menstruating. And it basically is characterized by a combination of symptoms. So that would be things like irregular periods. They may have ovarian cysts. They may have infertility issues. They may notice excessive body hair or hirsutism. So there's various sort of symptoms that classify the syndrome. They may also experience hair thinning or even what we consider sort of male pattern baldness, so balding in a way that would be expected to be seen more in men. And acne as well is a big symptom as well. And it's a case of that insulin resistance can be one of those symptoms as well. So women who have insulin resistance, there's a strong chance they also have PCOS that they would need to be checked for. Very often with PCOS, there's a diabetic grandparent, which sounds a bit random, but there's often a link with that.
Yeah. And I think the thing that comes to me here is that that's where empathy and sensitivity needs to really play a role, because you might come across somebody and you just judge them for, their appearance, but you don't know that this person is actually going through quite a lot.
100%. So I always feel very, very strongly that when someone walks into my office, it doesn't matter what their weight is, what the age is, what the reasons are for being there. They all are individuals that are looking for help for their various reasons and their various needs. And I think that for so many of them, especially for someone who's very overweight, they've been very sort of sidelined by the medical profession very often. Very often things are disregarded. Well, you just need to lose weight. Like, whatever's wrong with them, you're diabetic, you have high blood pressure, you have a sore toe, whatever it is, it's their weight. And it's so important just to recognize that all of them are people, that they individually have their own needs, and one can't sort of disregard things just based solely on weight, whatever the situation is.
True. Sure. So we're going to still continue or move on to hormonal issues. And I just want to maybe start off with like a basic breakdown, just like what are hormones and what are their, function or purpose in our bodies?
Sure. So hormones are proteins in the body that are chemical messengers that essentially act on various sort of body components, organs, tissues, cells, etc., to create certain results. So not all hormones necessarily relate to weight. There are various hormones that do all sorts of different things. But, everybody's heard of thyroid hormones, and everyone's familiar with estrogen and progesterone and testosterone. But there are other hormones as well that are involved in general in terms of the way the body functions.
And so you mentioned that there's also key ones that could potentially be barriers in this topic.
Sure. So the most common one that everyone always thinks about when it comes to weight is thyroid or thyroid hormones. So the thyroid is a gland in your neck that secretes thyroid hormones and essentially is controlled by another hormone that's secreted by the pituitary gland, which is the base of the brain, and it acts on that thyroid gland to produce thyroid hormones. So thyroid hormones are very important in terms of regulating your metabolism or your metabolic rate. And when those thyroid hormone levels are low and in small amounts, it can lead to a slowing of the metabolic rate and then obviously weight gain as well. And it has other, if we're looking at symptoms of an underactive thyroid, sort of other signs other than weight gain, maybe, for example, once again, hair loss, constipation, extreme fatigue or exhaustion, and sensitivity to cold. So obviously now when it's sort of a bit chillier, the weather, sometimes it's hard to tell. But if it's like the middle of summer and you're in 3 layers of jerseys, that obviously would be more of a cold sensitivity and potentially an issue. So the thyroid hormone, your thyroid could be underactive because your thyroid gland isn't functioning as it should, or there could be some sort of issue in terms of the way that sort of messaging process happens in terms of the brain telling your thyroid to produce thyroid hormones. So there's various factors in that respect. But it's a very easy blood test to do to check whether there's an issue. And if your thyroid is underactive, you can take thyroid hormones and that can help to regulate it, and obviously would then help in turn if weight is a consequence of that for you. Leptin is also a hormone related to weight. So leptin is not something that people always necessarily think of or familiar with. So essentially, it's produced by the actual fat cells. So as I was saying, fat does secrete various hormones and various sort of other chemical messages. And so what leptin does is it helps you to actually regulate your appetite levels. So it basically then would signal to the brain, okay, we've got enough fat stores. We don't need to eat necessarily more. So now your appetite would be reduced, and you would also potentially also increase your energy expenditure. So increase sort of like your calorie burn naturally throughout the day. And therefore it would help in terms of keeping you from overeating or keeping you from feeling like you need more food. However, if you have something called leptin resistance, which is leptin resistance in addition to insulin resistance, if that is the case, then that means that signaling process is kind of a bit sort of affected negatively or a bit impaired, and that can then mean that you're more likely to overeat and more likely to gain weight. By sort of I guess one could say the antagonist to that is ghrelin, which is otherwise known as the hunger hormone. And ghrelin is made in the stomach and actually stimulates your appetite. So it then actually tells you to eat and would increase before you eat and would decrease after eating. So they found that in people who are obese, that actually their ghrelin levels can be higher and therefore can be one of the factors that cause them to overeat and more likely to gain weight as well. Then there's cortisol, which is produced by the adrenal glands, and that is a stress hormone that helps to control your energy breakdown or metabolism. And when your levels of cortisol are higher, especially if you're under stress, that can lead to an increased appetite as well, and also more likely of accumulation of fat in the abdominal area. And then lastly, there's adiponectin, which is a hormone that is produced by the fat cells and is involved with keeping your glucose level, your glucose metabolism and fat metabolism under control. And if your adiponectin levels are high, that can mean that you have sort of good insulin levels and a lower body weight. But when they are low, it can mean that it's more likely to be seen in people overweight or obese. So there's so many factors. Obviously hormonal reasons are just part of it, but you can see obviously that there are a lot of hormones that can affect it and can play a role.
And I mean, so far, the things that you mentioned, like the hormones, even insulin resistance, some of these can actually work together. Because I learned that if your cortisol levels is really high, that can also affect, your insulin and so on and so forth.
Yes, exactly. So often they are interconnected. And that's, I think, is the most why sort of the human body is so incredible and fascinating, because it's very rarely can we say one thing is sort of affecting a sort of situation. There's such a multifactorial aspect in terms of different hormones, different lifestyle factors, whatever it may be, certain circumstances that may be present that affect how the person's health would be, how their weight would be. It's certainly never just one thing.
Sure. Wow. It's a lot.
Yes.
I feel like each one deserves its own episode.
Yes.
Alrighty.
Yes.
Now we're going to move on to the next one, which is emotional eating. Very interesting one. What is emotional eating and how does this show up?
So emotional eating is something that I must just say that I'm extremely passionate about, because I think that it's so under-recognized in terms of how it can affect people and what it actually means. So emotional eating essentially means eating for emotional reasons. But that's sort of like just sort of as an overview. But obviously falling into that is binge eating. Also related to that would be sort of a temporary state. So say, for example, maybe someone eats when they're stressed more, but they're actually generally their eating is under control. It can even be eating out of habit, that every time they go to the movies, they have to have popcorn, not because they're hungry, but because that's what they're doing. Movies. So it's really, one can say anything that sort of has an emotional basis, but would cause you to eat for reasons other than hunger, basically.
Sure. Wow. In one of the articles that I read, they made an example where they said, say, for instance, when you were sad, your grandmother would give you, a piece of chocolate or whatever. And so you started associating chocolate with, that comfort. So that also falls into that.
100%. Yes, 100%. Yes, sure. That would fall into it. So that's why I don't believe in rewarding kids with food. Like, don't go, oh, you've been such a good girl, you can have a chocolate, or you did so well in your race, let's go for an ice cream. You can have celebratory moments around food, but it shouldn't be that food becomes the reward or the punishment. And it's these messages. I mean, there's a whole separate podcast all on the topic of childhood body image, which, as I said, I'm very passionate about. But when I was doing my master's, one of the questions, I spoke to 8 and 9-year-olds, and one of the girls who was 8, the question I had to answer was, do you feel guilty of eating sweets? And so she said, at the age of 8, us girls and chocolate. So I said, well, what about us girls and chocolate? So she said, it's a cure for a broken heart. So I said, you're 8. How many broken hearts have you had? So she said, well, I haven't, but my mom has had. So it's those kinds of messages which seem so innocuous, but then create sort of these connections that then last for a lifetime, basically.
Sure, that's so deep. And I guess maybe just getting into this then is, I look at, for instance, alcohol, which I think if, you're dealing with somebody who, for instance, has an alcohol addiction, it's such a hard thing because it's so rooted in our everyday life. And I think with food as well, when you celebrate, you eat, like you're saying now, when you're having a heartbreak, you're having chocolate or, these messages. So how does one recognize that, actually, I am eating emotionally, versus I'm just living my life?
Sure. So one of my favorite things to do to kind of pick up these sorts of patterns is a food diary. I feel like I talk about food diaries constantly because I feel very strongly about how well they work. And so when I say food diary, I mean that you're going to record ideally the time you eat and what you eat. So that's sort of at the most basic level. But you could also add to that extra layers of in terms of making notes of where you are when you're eating, how you're feeling. Are you feeling happy, sad, irritated, angry, whatever the emotions are? And then you can start to pick up patterns like, okay, always I see mid-afternoon is a time that I struggle. okay, so that's the time that I need to be more aware of, because that's the time when I'm more likely to make poor food choices and to not actually be genuinely hungry at that time. Or maybe to go, okay, well, I see whenever I'm with this friend, they're a bit of a bad influence. So I know that when I'm around them, I need to be extra cautious in terms of my food choices. So food diaries are really, I would say, the best tool and are so effective in terms of picking up patterns. But I do think that most people do have some sort of awareness, whether they're open to it or not, that when they're eating, they're not necessarily that hungry. For many people, they might even actually not even know when they're hungry because they've overridden their natural hunger cues, which so it can be quite challenging. But in theory, if you are eating when you're hungry and you're stopping when you're full, that's the ideal, best from a weight point of view. And the best way to do that is really go, okay, well, let's keep a food diary for a week, pick up these patterns, and I can start to pay more attention to how hungry I am, what I eat at various times, and whether I'm eating the right amount at various points. So it's a very useful tool and definitely one that I'd recommend to help identify that as well. Generally, if one's hungry and one eats something that's, relatively balanced, you're not going to feel guilty. But people would most likely feel guilty after emotional eating as a general rule.
Yeah. And such a complex, and layered topic. So is it possible to overcome it, or is it just one of those situations that you just need to learn coping or tools to deal with it, to manage it?
So it definitely can be overcome. I've seen many people have amazing success in terms of improving their emotional eating behaviors. Depending on how sort of severe it is, it may be something that's obviously a little bit harder to overcome, and it may be something that always sort of lingers and is always sort of hanging around in the back of their mind as a coping mechanism, because usually that's what it is. So it's a case of that if they have that awareness in terms of, okay, this is what I'm doing, this is my current pattern, then obviously then there's opportunity to change it. But unfortunately, for a lot of people, they don't necessarily take the necessary steps to improve it.
And then you also mentioned a lack of knowledge.
Yes. So the lack of knowledge, I think, is a tricky one, because lack of knowledge also comes into confusing messages. So in other words, people might just not know what source to listen to. They saw something on TV, then they had a friend say what worked for them, then there's something that they know worked for them, 15 years ago, and they just feel kind of lost. Or there might be those people who just don't know anything, that have never been exposed to any sort of information around healthy eating and just don't know. So lack of knowledge, there's many things that come into it. But it's really a case of making sure that your sources for nutritional knowledge and the topic, that the sources are reputable. If it's one of those emails that someone sends you where everything is in bold letters and every line is a different color, it's generally not reputable. You know those emails, right?
Yeah.
So there's like fear-mongering, crazy emails that make you feel like you're going to die in 1 second if you ever eat whatever the food is. That's a problem.
So this information is really so empowering and inspiring. So we're going to get into the last two, which was, I think you mentioned money and medical. So we'll kick it off with the money one.
Sure. So in terms of from the financial side, one cannot say that financial reasons are that if someone is struggling financially, that automatically it has to affect their weight. But I do think there is a tendency towards giving preference to obviously cheaper foods, which often are not necessarily the protein foods, but more likely to be things like refined starches and sort of often foods that are sort of overly processed, which is going to be more likely to cause weight gain. However, at the same time, if one is using certain methods to choose the right sort of balanced foods, there are options that one can still eat healthily in a cost-effective way. So say, for example, if you are choosing fruits and vegetables that are seasonal, that's always cheaper than ones that will say on it that they're imported from Spain or wherever they're from. So choosing local seasonal produce, buying in bulk where possible, so that's always important. Legumes are great. So legumes give you protein, fiber, antioxidants, and they're cheap. So there's no reason why that should not be something that's part of your diet. So that's very beneficial. And also to choose vegetables as more of a priority in the diet. And that's something that I think, regardless of, what your situation is financially, weight, whoever you are, everybody should eat more vegetables. Ideally, for everybody, half their plate should be vegetables. And instead of it being like, oh, okay, well, we've got our meat, we've got our potatoes, I guess we should throw something green on the plate. It'd rather be, okay, this is the vegetables I'm having tonight. What am I having with the vegetable? So to really kind of shift that focus, because vegetables are so important. So from a financial point of view, if you're choosing local produce, vegetables don't have to be expensive. So to choose the right ones, frozen vegetables are fine. Just don't cook them to death. Remember, they're partly cooked. So just to start to include more vegetables in your diet, and that in itself is such an excellent way to really help to improve your weight and your health overall, and also to extend your protein to make it more cost effective. So if you're having mincemeat, you could add lentils to that. You could add grated carrots, whatever vegetables you've got around. So just to then actually decrease your starch intake and your protein intake to have enough vegetables. You might be thinking, why am I saying decrease your protein intake? You don't need to have excessive amount of protein. So half your plate should be vegetables, a quarter starch, a quarter protein, basically.
So basically, in short, you can't say, oh, there's no money at home, I'm going to eat pap and wors every day.
Yes, exactly. You can do your pap and wors, but you have a little bit less of each, and you put some vegetables on the other half of the plate. And that's okay.
Got it.
And on the point of pap, incidentally, just on the point of
yes,
if you're going to have pap, yes, it doesn't have to be bad, okay? But what you want to do is cook it, allow it to cool, and then reheat it. So in other words, you can make it in advance, and that will have a better effect on your blood sugar than when it was initially cooked. So just putting that up.
Oh, so you cook it and then you allow it to cool down.
Yes, and then you reheat it. That goes for like most starches actually that works. So rice, potatoes, etc. So that allows something called resistant starch to form, which basically means that it's sort of a bit harder for the body to digest, which has a better effect on your blood sugar control. So just to make it a little bit healthier, do that with your pap.
Oh my gosh, Lila, thank you so much. I'm definitely going to be trying that.
Pleasure. Yeah.
All right. Last but certainly not least, we've got medical.
Yes. So obviously we touched on that already in terms of all the hormonal reasons. But I think also something that comes into weight loss in relation to medical reasons quite a lot is anything that physically makes it hard to exercise or to eat healthy. So if someone has some sort of injury or disability or medical condition that makes it quite hard to manage their weight. And that's always a challenge. It does mean potentially that based on the situation, they may need to have slightly lower calorie intake. They may need to find other forms of physical activity where possible. It may mean that they need to sort of be extra careful where other people can get away with a little bit more in terms of their eating. But I've had many people who have various reasons or various sort of physical reasons that might otherwise keep them from weight loss, but they still manage to be successful because they find a way to work around that particular condition that they have. So it's always as possible. I think also on that point, I'm just thinking is coming into medical is also medication. So say, for example, if someone is on many psychiatric medications, certain of those medications do have sort of more of an issue in terms of weight gain. They are strongly linked to weight gain, but I feel very strongly that mental health should always come first. So I wouldn't say to someone, well, go off your medication because of that. But certainly it is the case that certain medications is going to make weight loss harder. And you do need to, and once again, be extra careful, maybe do extra exercise, and just accept that you have to kind of trust the process. It might be a little bit harder or take a little bit longer for you to lose weight than someone else.
And where do you then come in? Like, how does your role come in situations like this?
So I do often get referrals from doctors. So whether it's for specific medical conditions that need to be managed from a dietary point of view, or whether maybe there's simply a weight issue and the doctors might refer because of that. But most people would come of their own accord And it would usually be, whether it's sort of straight weight loss, whether it's for some medical condition that they realize that dietary changes are necessary for. And I mean, as I mentioned earlier, eating disorders are a big passion of mine as well. So I do work closely with some psychologists as well and psychiatrists to manage eating disorders. And I think on that point, binge eating disorder is a big one also that affects weight as well. So binge eating disorder in itself, I guess, comes into emotional eating, but is a big reason for weight gain. And so for a lot of people, they might find that they have episodes of eating where they feel out of control, which obviously would be more likely to lead to weight gain as well. But more importantly than that is managing the emotional side around it and accepting that obviously there is some sort of emotional aspect to it that needs to be dealt with, and they need a multidisciplinary approach to approach that. So if there's anyone listening who finds that they have periods of time where they struggle to control their eating, they feel out of control of the time, they find then that those episodes of overeating is then accompanied with a lot of guilt and shame, and they really struggle to manage it. I think it's important to just remove that stigma and to accept that it's also okay to just realize that maybe you need a bit of extra help and to get the help that's needed and address that accordingly. Because there's just so much negative effect that those kinds of issues can have on one's self-esteem and mood and just general sort of sense of self. So it's important to keep that in mind as well.
Mm. You mentioned earlier on, finances. So I'm kind of keen to know if somebody's perhaps unable to afford the services of a Lila.
Yes.
Are there options out there?
I know the way you put that, yes. Yes. So, I mean, there are, I don't want to mention specific like places, or I want to be endorsing, but I mean, there are some sort of weight loss program, slimming club sort of things that can work, but just check that they're ones that don't cut out food groups. I don't like these sorts of places that go, well, you can never look at like Profita ever again because, you will gain 50 kilos overnight. So it's got to be balanced in terms of having sort of the carbohydrates and the proteins and the fats and have a balance. There's also, there's a couple of sort of potential online resources which can be more reputable, but just be wary in terms of those sources. You don't want to kind of do anything too crazy. Just be wary of that. And then also, most of the big public hospitals do have dietitians there that you would be able to see potentially for free. Yes, I can attest to that. I did my community service at Helen Joseph Hospital, and we were there every day. And so there's most of the big hospitals. Actually, I mean, I'd say all of them do, but not all of them necessarily have outpatient clinics. So your big hospitals like the Jen, Ara, obviously I'm talking about Joburg now, Helen Joseph, as I mentioned, although it was a while ago that I was there, so I'm assuming they still do. They have outpatient clinics where you could see a dietitian in there if you wanted. So that is also an option. Yeah.
And Lila, how do we get a hold of you? Are you on social media? Is there a contact?
Sure. So my website address is www.lilabruk.co.za. So that's spelled Lilabruk. So lilabruk.co.za. My Instagram is lilabruk_dietitian. Facebook is Lila Bruk Dietitian, one word. And my email address is lilabruk@gmail.com. So all of those options, so you can go to my website and get more info if you'd like.
Amazing. And when we obviously share the episode, we'll also link to those details. Any last thoughts that you would like to share as we wrap up?
So I think, a last thought is that if you are listening to this and you're struggling with your weight, that just to know that you're not alone, that there's always a solution, and it doesn't necessarily always mean that that solution is depressing and restrictive and horrible, but more about just finding really what works for you. And everybody's situation is different. So don't feel that if something worked for someone else and doesn't work for you, that you failed. It's all about finding your personal solution, and it is out there, and just don't lose hope.
A very big thank you to my guest, Lila Bruk. Thank you so much for joining us on this episode. It has been super insightful. Be sure to catch her on her socials. But before you log off, can I also ask you to subscribe to our channel so you can always catch our latest episodes, and feel free to share your comments. What did you think of today's episodes? Do you have any questions for any of our guests? And are there any other episodes that you would like to suggest for us? Your comments or your suggestions are always welcome. If you're a brand or a business that would like to chat to us about collaborations, feel free to drop us an email, colorfullayerspodcast@gmail.com. Cheers!